welcome to day 2 of an interview I'm having with someone that's, well, she's kind of mean and a little bit judgmental. She's a meanie lady. We're talking about Julie Roys. She has the Roys Report. She's an investigative journalist. Her work has appeared in World Magazine, Christianity Today. She's had a radio show at Moody. And I'll tell you what, she's all educated up as well. Master's degree, broadcast journalism, and a bachelor. You got that from Wheaton. And happily married, 3 children and 2 grandkids. We've been having a interesting conversation, one like I've never had on the broadcast, because we're naming names. And in reality, you're a gift to the body of Christ. You're a courageous believer. And, I'd say a clean warrior. Not too many get that title for me. My wife is one. It's women who step in the gap to do the right thing regardless of the consequences. And nothing but respect for you, Julie. Thanks for being on the program today. Day number 2.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, you have called out names from John MacArthur to Ravi Zacharias to even Moody Bible Institute, and you were working there at the time, and you had a radio program, and then you didn't.
Right.
So you have to count the consequences, knowing that what you say and what you do, it can affect you. So question number 1, have you ever had a lawsuit come against you because of your investigative journalism?
I have. Yeah. That was before I published anything about James MacDonald. I had spent probably close to 6 months investigating because people had come to me. I mean, people who had been really hurt and abused by James MacDonald came to me and just pleaded with me. This was on the heels of me blowing the whistle on Moody. They saw what I had done there and said, "Hey, will you look into James MacDonald?" And I remember at the time I was like, I want to do an investigation on another big name Christian about as much as I want a hole in the head, I
Right.
mean, I was just like,
Do y'all
that
hear
is
that?
brutal.
This is not something you wake him and go, who can we go after? That is not
Uh,
you, and that's not your character.
well, and it's hard. I mean, it's not good work calling out people's sin. I mean, people come back at you and a lot of nasty things are said about you. But this was one of those where I remember I was like, well, okay, I'll hear your story. And then I heard story after story
Mm,
after
mm.
story after story. And then I tell people I have kind of an internal justice meter. And when that gets tripped, it's just,
It's on.
it's on and you can't let it go at that
Yeah.
point. And so that's when I knew God was calling me to do this. So I started reaching out to people on staff at Harvest because I always, just professional standards, you always give the other side a chance to respond to any accusations against them. And so I'd started doing that. Specifically, I'd reached out to James MacDonald about a woman who said that he assaulted her on a private jet, and that there were witnesses. And so I reached out about that, got a bunch of statements really quickly. And then before I was actually working with a Chicago Tribune reporter about, there was a youth pastor at Harvest who there were charges coming against him. I knew they were going to be filed soon. Some people told me about it, for sexual exploitation of a minor. And I was working on that with a reporter with Chicago Tribune, that story. And we were reaching out to Harvest. And in the midst of that, I got a lawsuit filed against me by Harvest. And it wasn't just me. He also included, I should say, it's James MacDonald and Harvest Bible Chapel. And it was against me and also the authors of this blog called The Elephant's Debt,
Right.
which was critical of Harvest, and the wives of the bloggers, which was, I guess they just threw them in for good measure. So it was the 5 of us that this lawsuit came against. And I was just stunned because I hadn't published anything. But what a lot of people don't know is that there was also a temporary restraining order that was tied to this lawsuit. So it really was an effort at prior restraint, which a lot of people don't know what prior restraint is, but it's unconstitutional. It's basically trying to muzzle somebody before they speak, and especially a member of the media before they say anything. And you can't do that in the United States. So it was shocking that he did it. And it actually, I never I never would have been able to expose the things that I did about James McDonald had he not sued me, because what happened was, because he had sued me, I was able to subpoena people. So I knew
Oh,
there were people
interesting.
out there who wanted to talk to me, but wanted an excuse to talk to me, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like they didn't want to have to answer for why they talked to me or went on the record, but it enabled me to begin subpoenaing them, and I did it. I was able to subpoena them. You have to tell the other side in a lawsuit when you subpoena somebody, but I was able to get statements from them before James McDonald was able to stop me, and that's
Wow.
when he quickly dropped the lawsuit when he saw how many things I was subpoenaing
Interesting.
and all the information. I mean, if you have skeletons in your closet, don't file a lawsuit. That's why it was so shocking that he did it, because everybody knew he had skeletons. But yeah, it was for me as a reporter. Once I had somebody, I actually a friend of mine who's a lawyer. He agreed from the very beginning to represent me and to do it pro bono. He ended up getting paid. In fact, Harvest ended up paying all of our legal fees after they dropped the lawsuit, because it was a frivolous lawsuit. It was uncalled for, and so they paid for all that. But once that was covered, I just knew the Lord had it, and He had me,
Mm.
and um, and it was actually kind of Christmas come early as a reporter. To have subpoena power was amazing. It really
I
was.
l I love that. I didn't know the backstory to that, which it makes a lot of sense because most people get terrified at the thought of standing up for what's right and, people accusing you of slandering or, whatever. I remember as a young Christian trying to understand, Christianity. There was it was a junior high boy who had been abused, uh, by someone in ministry,
Hmm,
and the ministry covered it up. And when I say covered it up, they didn't bring in law enforcement.
hmm,
Um, I obviously, that's the lane we run in now. We help law enforcement here in the US to find pedophiles, molesters, we recover kids, and then overseas. And I remember struggling because I was abused as a kid myself.
hmm,
And I thought, why wouldn't this church?" And it was actually the grandson of a very well-named ministry person. But yet I kind of fell underneath that I look at it now as an oppressive manipulation of, well, we're more spiritual, so we know what to do,
hmm,
versus it just being, well, what's practical and wise. And so the end of that story is many years later. I mean, gosh, 15, 20 years later, I had intervened in this young man's life who was suicidal in a home, and I got called.
hmm,
And it was because of undealt with abuse from his past and this big Christian family that covered it. And I'll never forget, they brought me in to help reconcile. And all I said was, "You guys, this guy's jacked up large in part because of y'all covering what you knew had happened. So he has PTSD,
hmm.
and y'all are part of the problem."
Oh,
Uh,
and so often it's not the crime, it's the church cover up of the crime that causes so much damage to people. It really is, because they can handle, and I think this has been the hardest thing for me too, is like I can handle that there's some bad apples out there, but what's hard is how many people support the bad apples knowing that there's
right.
been sin, knowing that there's been crimes.
And that is that's a sad reality, and it keeps victims in depression, suicidal,
Mm,
hurting,
mm,
not trusting, and certainly out of the faith. So when people say, I don't want to go to church, I often ask why, because some of them have very good reasons not to. But it's never a good reason to not trust Jesus, to go to Him and say, I think it was Gandhi that said, you know, I love Jesus or appreciate Jesus, but his followers are kind of crazy. So we in America have this reputation of, I think, with professional ministry, to do things on a level that success isn't necessarily measured by biblical standards. And
mm,
I had a board member of many well-known organizations tell me specifically not to pray for certain people or publicly come out and talk about spiritual warfare.
Hmm.
And he told me point blank, if you do, you won't speak here. This won't happen. And the money we were going to give you to help your ministry, and it was 7 figures. He
Wow.
goes, you'll never see a penny. And he goes, you have 3 days to decide. And I remember the first day I was so mad, Julie. I was like, this guy,
Hmm.
second day I told my wife, I'm taking the money. I said, my gosh, what we could do with that much money. She goes, really? Really? I said, no.
Hmm.
And then the third day, I just said, I'd rather help Christians than kowtow to some guy's checkbook or whatever. The sad thing is, still, key ministries have him in a position of leadership and authority. And again, I think that goes back to people with a gift or gifts, people admire far too much. But gifts and talents can take a person to a place where their character can't sustain them. And where did we go wrong on forgetting character counts?
um, that's an interesting statement. The character counts, right? Because, and I don't mean to step on some toes, but um, that was something that I heard an awful lot of when Bill Clinton was in office, and I stopped hearing when Trump got in office. And I'm not trying to make a political statement. I'm not
Right.
anti-Trump. I'm not, but I will say the rhetoric and caring about character and caring about the church in the past 4 years has been disheartening to me to see. Character is premium. It's huge, and we can't say we're Christians and not care about character. But something that you described, this gift of 7 figures that you were offered. I mean, that's just kind of touching on what I've called, actually, Skye Jethani, who's a speaker and author. He coined this term, the evangelical industrial complex, sort of a take on the military industrial complex we used to talk about. But he's saying in evangelicalism we have sort of an industrial complex or a celebrity machine. And I
Right.
saw it when I was at Moody. And it's not necessarily evil in the sense that you have publishers, you have radio, you have megachurch ministries, you have parachurch ministries, you have all of these different organizations and ministries, some for profit, some not for profit, but they all scratch each other's backs to a certain degree. I mean, the publisher wants to get his author at this conference, and
Yep.
if you're publishing a book, you've got to get all these people to endorse your book, and then they'll invite you to this event, and then you can speak here. And I mean, and then they'll give you a position, at this university or seminary or whatever. And it's actually a very small group of interconnected people that runs what we think of evangelicalism when we look at sort of the well-known celebrities, if you will.
Right.
They're all connected, and there is sort of this symbiotic relationship. And it could be, theoretically, it could be a healthy thing
Right. Right.
if you leverage those relationships to hold each other accountable. So when you have someone who is sinning, take, for example, you bring up covering up sex abuse in the church.
Right.
I've written extensively about Brian Loritz, who, when he was at Fellowship Memphis, again, this is the son of Crawford Loritz, very well-known African-American leader. And Brian Loritz, when he was at this church, there are allegations that, I mean, we know that he was given evidence, a cell phone containing videos that were taken of people secretly in a bathroom at the church.
Right.
That phone now is gone. His brother-in-law, who we know was later convicted of the crime of recording people without their knowledge, we know that he was fired from the church, but he was allowed to go to another church where he repeated his crimes.
Mm.
I have people on the record, insiders at the church, victims whose video was on that phone, who say that Brian Loritz was part of the cover-up of that
Right.
crime. Brian
Right.
Loritz was just hired last year by J.D. Greear, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, to be an executive pastor at Summit. I reported. And on top of that, Brian Loritz also calls himself doctor. I've looked into his doctorate. It's an honorary doctorate. He's doing exactly what Ravi Zacharias did with his credentials scandal. He got a doctorate At least Ravi got his honorary doctorates from reputable schools. Brian Laritz got an honorary doctorate from a school where the president of the school doesn't even have a doctorate. I looked that up. He says he went to Texas Christian University, and he hasn't. He was never there. The school told me they've never had a student by his name. It's a fraudulent school. I mean, it
Right.
was given an F rating by the Better Business Bureau. I mean, this is not a real school. He still goes by Dr. Brian Laritz. He's still at Summit Church. They don't even care about that. And when I ask about it, they're like, well, it's cultural. I'm like, lying is cultural? I thought that was kind of like one of the 10 commandments. But again, he's there. There's all these allegations of covering up sex crimes. Because I think there's been so much reporting about it, they finally are doing an investigation. But it's a very, very narrowly um, the only thing they're looking at in this investigation is whether or not Brian Laritz, they can prove that he did something wrong with this phone and with, actually pressuring women not to report, which I don't know if they're going to be able to. It's going to be a he said, she said, probably. There's other things involved that they're not going to look at. But again, these sorts of things happening in the church, not being held accountable, and you've got this web, right, of all these interconnected. I mean, the Southern Baptist Convention, Summit Church, J.D. Greer, all these people. You would think that would leverage to bring accountability, but instead we see there seems to be protection, there seems to be covering. I'm glad. I'm glad there's finally an investigation, although I don't really have that high of hopes for this investigation really being that independent or finding anything. But yes, this is a major, major issue within the church where I think we need to start thinking about all of these interconnected relationships. And if we're not willing to call our friends out, then we're not really being friends, because that's the best thing for them is to repent.
Did I not tell y'all she was a meanie, judgmental, gossipy woman? Woman. We haven't even started talking about your book
Hmm.
on feminism. Oh wait, no, it's redeeming the feminine soul. Which honestly, we're gonna have to put that on a different broadcast because that stands by itself, and it's so important to cover. But here we're talking about something that is systemic,
Hmm.
not isolated,
Hmm.
and abuse within the church, lack of leadership, lying, the simple stuff, right? I mean, lying, what we call, in the church today, acceptable sin. Christians, to me, are some of the most naive and a lot of time just non-discerning, because, again, I think it starts at the top oftentimes where set the bar, set a standard, talk truth, be honest, hold people accountable, uh, and it's spread. It's out of the church into the nonprofits. I am hoping that you will consider um, one day investigating one of the spaces we work in, which is the counter and anti-sex trafficking world, because there's a lot of stuff going on,
Hmm.
and people often ask me, um, "Hey, so and so and this and that and this do you associate with them?" And we say, "No."
Hmm.
We we just politely and respectfully say, "We don't." Um, so I know there's been some articles, and the problem is, like, Vice just did a report on an organization with Tim Ballard and Operation Underground Rescue, but most Christians, I literally posted on it and said, "I think this may be an article that is worth reading, that causes concerns." I'm actually
Hmm.
not even making a judgment against or you, but there are some things that we should read that are concerning. And Christians need to use critical thinking skills, look deeper. And yet, I got a pretty overwhelming response of this is just the left trying to destroy. Yeah, it goes into conspiracy theories. They love Trump now. It's just all, it gets weird. And I just go, I just think we should always be willing to read something if it's factual. And maybe you can look into this realm because I can tell you there are a lot of organizations doing bad things in the name of
Hmm.
counter sex trafficking.
Hmm.
And what it hurts because people say, well, are you guys jealous? Or jealous? You
Mhm.
kidding me? We could use 10,000 well-run organizations fighting this issue,
Yeah.
but we worry about the people who suffer, kids and
Mm.
women, and then Christians who will support certain organizations. And I'm not saying that Operation Underground Rescue is bad. I don't know them well enough, but people need when you get burnt, like Ravi, when organizations fall, then people who support and pray they pull back because they're hurt, and then that stops the effective work of whatever we're running into.
Yeah, and I hate that. I do. I hope that people can see that you can still be a part of the church. I mean, the majority
Right,
of pastors out there are good, honest, usually
solid,
underpaid, you
yeah,
know,
hardworking,
hardworking men, godly men. And so um, I hate when I hear that, they've given up on all of the church because there's so much beauty in the church. And I still believe in the church. And I've seen the ugliest of the ugly, right?
right,
I love the church. I believe in her. I believe that the gates of hell won't prevail over her. And someday we're all going to be the church together in front of the throne of Christ. And so we better believe in it because it's gonna outlive our lifetime on this planet. So I hope people believe in that. I hope they believe in ministries, but I also hope they learn. It's one of those burn me once, shame on you, burn me twice, shame on me.
right,
Let's be smart
right,
donors. Let's investigate the places where we donate. You can get 990s. You can research what people are doing. You can find out how much people are making. See if you're okay with it. But do your homework. Don't just
right,
assume that because somebody seems like a great person that they necessarily are.
right. And speaking of 990s and accountability, ECFA.
Hmm.
ECFA used to be the gold standard. We've belonged to it for years, and then not so much. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, I don't know that they've ever been the gold standard. I think they had that reputation, but if you go
Okay.
back and you remember when we were kids, the PTL scandal, right?
Yes. Yep.
That was the first I remember when that happened. I was never a big Jim Baker fan, but it was shocking to me when that broke, and he's spent time in jail for fraud now.
Right.
But when that was happening, they became members of the ECFA.
Right.
And it wasn't the ECFA who brought accountability to PTL Ministries. It was when the secular press began publishing about the fraud
Mhm.
that was going on that then ECFA actually removed them as members. But we've seen the same thing. Gospel for Asia, when they
Oh my.
removed their membership from ECFA, it was after the news reports. I remember when I was reporting on Harvest Bible Chapel, I reached out to ECFA and I'm like, these integrated auxiliaries that they have, the way that they're moving their money, and then we've got this deer farm that they're funding, and I hear there's 20% of the budget that's a black budget. Nobody knows what's happening with that. We don't know what's happening with executive salaries. We find out that James McDonald was making close to $1 million, and then he had, by the way, the close to $1 million. ECFA is reviewing those salaries and saying that's okay.
Oh my.
Because if you look at the compensation committees or groups that they go to, some
Right.
of these groups, if you look at who's a member, it's people like Paula White, it's Joel Osteen.
Right.
So they're comparing the salaries to what they're making. And they're like, well, yeah, it's kind of in the ballpark because they're a megachurch pastor. So when you hear that, oh, yeah, it's reviewed by a compensation committee and this is in line with what the industry standard is, know that the industry standard is ridiculous. I mean, if you think pastors should be making $1 million salaries, then okay, fine. But I wasn't brought up that way. I can't see a justification for it. And so, I just challenge people to look at that. But yeah, ECFA came in because when I was investigating Harvest, did like a 1-day review of them and gave them the thumbs up. And it wasn't
Oh
until
my.
I just kept reporting and I got more and more and more information about how the money was being misused that they finally, I mean, it was really, I mean, this is months later after so much has come out. Now they've done an independent audit of the church and found out even more things about how the money was misused. But again, they were ECFA members the whole time. So I think what people should know, ECFA has great standards. I mean, I would
Right.
look at their standards and say, man, they're outstanding. I think some of them aren't stringent enough. For
Okay.
example, when it comes to independence of a board, as long as you have a majority of members on your board who are independent, they'll let it pass. And to me, if you've got a board of 6 members and 3 are family members and 3 aren't,
All right.
that's not okay.
Right.
So,
That's kind of common sense. I mean, you would think,
you would
right?
think, but I just recently looked, I mean, and this is, I mean, I recently looked at Beth Moore's 990. She doesn't make an exorbitant salary, okay? And I like Beth Moore,
Right.
but I'm looking at her board, and there's all these family members.
Right.
And, maybe she didn't know any better. I think sometimes Christians, they put people on and they think, well, this
True.
is okay. I mean, yeah, I
Right.
trust them. Why wouldn't I have a family member there? And so anyway, ECFA has great standards. If you follow those standards, you'll probably avoid some of these pitfalls. The problem is they don't enforce their standards. They don't have a vehicle for enforcing it, and they're paid by the organizations that they, give their seal to. So if you're a member of ECFA, you paid for that. So they
Right.
have a conflict of interest that's inherent. And I'm not really sure how you solve that, to be honest.
Okay.
Like, who's going to pay for it if the member organizations don't pay? So, again, my impetus is I want to get as many people educated, um, so that we're educated donors and we know how to give our money wisely, and we don't just give it and then not care where it goes. Part of stewardship is not just stewarding your money so that you can be generous with it. That's important, and that's part of being a godly giver, a sacrificial giver. That's important. But another part of it is actually giving wisely, stewarding that money, finding out about the organizations you give to. And I do say to people too, it's funny. I mean, we are such a shoestring organization. And I was talking to one guy who's a
Right.
multimillionaire once, and I'm like, hey, why don't you give to us? And he's like, Julie, you know what? People like to build buildings. That's what people
Right.
get excited about. He said,
Right.
you're like the housing inspector. Nobody likes the housing inspector. And I'm like, you know what? You're absolutely right. But that's why so many of our houses are falling down, because there
True.
is no housing inspector. And so I tell people, you know, just remember us, remember the watchdog groups out there, and give us 1 or 2% of your tithe, above your tithe. I'm not telling people to give less than their tithe, but give us 1 or 2% of that and think of it as tithe insurance, because somebody needs to be holding these places accountable, or this stuff's just going to continue.
I love that tithe insurance, and I'm gonna use that, and that's actually one of the reasons why we support you,
Thank you.
because it's what's needed in the body of Christ, you know? A lot of buildings going up, a lot of programs going forward, but if you're building a huge boat and nobody's checking for the seams and water leaks and stability of it, we're just pouring money into broken cisterns, and I do pray that our listeners and followers will go to julieroys.com
Mhm.
and definitely sign up for the uh, Roy's Report, roysreport.com. And I get that weekly. And again, some of it I go, no, I don't need to learn about that. No. And then others, I'm like, wow, I did not know that. We do a daily intelligence brief here at ATP Ministries and the Victor Marx Group. And we have analysts. We've got, incredible group of and we put this out plus a premium, and I'll tell you, people are really turning to that. I mean, in a short
Mm.
amount of time, we're over 70,000 people just on that,
Wow.
and they want truth. So I look forward to, again. I hope that you grow, Julie, to a place to where you have a plethora of analysts, reporters, journalists, and then also a team that can go to ministries that open the doors and say yes,
Mm.
audit our books, do an independent study, and they don't even have to pay them for it, right?
Yeah.
Because it's weird if you're paying for somebody to audit you.
I mean, we've talked about there's a lot of things we would love to do if we had the resources to do it. But part of it is we're going to do another conference. We've done one conference called Restore Chicago. Because of COVID, we weren't able to do it. We're going to do another conference probably next spring. And what we'd like to do is even have a pre-conference. It's a track for people to come and learn how to be a trustee member or a board member.
Oh,
What is
nice.
involved in good governance? If you're in leadership, what should you be looking for? What is spiritual abuse? How do you know? People sometimes engage in spiritual abuse and they don't even realize they're doing it.
Right.
So, I mean, these are things that they're not teaching at seminary. They should be teaching at seminary. I wish they were, but we'd like to begin to offer those things in education. So we're working on that, at making that a part of what we do, because we don't just want to be reporting the truth and reporting, difficult, often, unvarnished truth of things that we wish weren't going on, but we also want to be a part of restoring the church and making
And
the bride
preventing.
beautiful. And prevention is
Preventing.
huge. Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
that's what I see. So please go check out our website, sign up for a newsletter. You won't be disappointed. Julie, as we close now, there
Mhm.
are 2 questions I ask my guests,
Oh,
and
okay.
we never tell them what they are, but they matter. The first one, it's really subjective only because it's what each person's perception is of Victor Marx and his wife and our ministry. What is your perception of us?
Well, Victor, there aren't a lot of people who are willing, because I think I've become a lightning rod. Anybody that stands close to me, when I get hit by lightning, they can get hit by lightning too. You might get some pushback even for having me on this program, and because I talked pretty freely about my investigations and the things I've done. And so what I see is that you and your wife are willing to stand for truth, even if the
Mm,
truth is hard. And I do remember when I first reported on Ravi, you reached out and your wife reached out, and man, you gave me some pushback. And I loved it, because I'm like, you know what? I expect that if you have an issue with me, you'll bring it to me. And so I like that you brought it to me, but you also listened.
yes.
You listened and you were willing to engage. And I think part of it, I said too, stay tuned. There's more coming. This is the
Yeah.
tip of the iceberg. And in fact, it ended up being
It
the tip of the iceberg. I knew there
some
was much
mm,
more. It takes time to report those things and to report them well, but I knew it was all coming. And so I see people of integrity who care about the purity of the church and about truth, and are willing to stand for it. And the fact that you're involved. I mean, I found out something. I didn't realize you were an abuse victim. I
yeah.
have found that people who get my ministry are in large part at some point in their life, whether it's spiritual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse, know what that experience is like to be completely disenfranchised and to have somebody powerful take advantage of you. And so I see people whose heart is tender towards the vulnerable, and
Mm,
that makes me feel like we're kindred spirits.
thank you. And I would agree, we are.
Mm.
That's why we're drawn to you and appreciate you. Last question. We're all gonna die.
Hmm.
When you die, what happens to you and why do you believe it?
I think when I die, I'm going to stand before God and give an account.
Mm,
And I actually, people don't know this about me because I don't really publicize it much, but I used to write music and perform music.
mm,
And I had one song, and it was just called Good and Faithful Servant. It's probably one of the most meaningful songs I've done, because what I live for is someday to stand before Christ and to hear from him. I pray I will hear from him. Well done, good and faithful servant. Come and receive your reward. I want to be someone that pleased him and that he's
mm.
pleased with. So that's what I'm living for. We're just passing through. Our lives are like the dew that's gone by afternoon. So I mean, yeah, this life, don't put a lot of stock in it. It's the next one that matters.
Well, that's my broad and eyes scripture or saying that we're just passing through.
Yeah.
And what you believe and what we believe is all scriptural based. And I love hearing that. Many of you today now have maybe never heard of Julie, or you had heard of her, but you thought of her differently, maybe as a meanie, judgmental gossiper. And yet now you know who she really is, someone that needs prayer
Mm.
because she's ultimately fighting forces of darkness that have infiltrated the church. Of course, man's sin and carnality, but pray for her, support her. I can't say it enough. That's why we do. Julie, thanks for being on the broadcast today. And God bless you and look forward to seeing you soon.
Well, thanks for having me, and God bless you, and your ministry may continue to grow it and prosper.
Thank you. So wherever you are, whatever lane God has you in, follow him and get it done.